Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Josh Hodges. I'm the host of Online with an Architect. Very happy to have my good friend and jiu-jitsu training partner, Anthony Koochew, with me today. Welcome, Anthony.
It's good to be here.
Fantastic. So, everyone knows me. Let's do a quick intro of you. Tell us what you're doing and a bit of your background.
Absolutely. It's funny. I'll start with the non-IT side because that's how we know each other. So, jiu-jitsu, been training that for a while, I'm a black belt, and I'm also a CEO and co-founder of Azure Consulting. And I started Azure about 8 years ago when my co-founder, well, my mentor at the time said, hey, I think there's an opportunity to start an Azure-specific consultancy inside of Australia.
Before Azure was really popular as well, actually, autonomy-wise.
Absolutely. But it was really popular in the UK. So he thought that the UK was about 2 years ahead of Australia. And at the time, there's a longer story there, but at the time I had just quit my job and I was building a social enterprise cafe, and I'd been doing that for about 9 months, and I was burnt out. I was just, it was a lot of fun, but it's a crazy, crazy environment. And so the thought of going back to something that I knew, which was IT, was really, really welcome. So I kind of ran back into it, and I started to learn, I'd done a lot of work in the Microsoft space prior, but I was a generalist. So I was kind of, I'd always looked at specialist organizations, and I was like, man, wouldn't it be great to just do the same thing over and over again? And now looking as a specialist organization, that is great to do the same thing over and over again because you can get better and better at it, and you can go deeper into the stack. And now, so 8 years, we now have an office in the UK. There's an office in Australia. There's about 30 in Australia and about another 10 or so in the UK. We'll do a lot of work with Microsoft and Telstra. We've brought our own solutions to market. And overwhelmingly, we just help customers build, migrate, and manage solutions built in Azure and Microsoft 365.
Yeah, and no surprise, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to focus on Azure and all the different capabilities, pros and cons, and things like that. So I think it's going to be a really fun one.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk. What is Azure and what is native cloud? There's an hour conversation.
Yeah. A friend of mine that we work with, he's obsessed with language, and he went and asked everyone in the team what the word deploy meant. And he got 15 different answers about what deploy was. And I know that you and I intuitively know what deploy means. You need to deploy, right? And cloud's a bit like that. So my favorite working definition for cloud is your computer, your data, someone else's computer, is probably the simplest working explanation for it. And then native cloud and public cloud being one of the major hyperscalers like Amazon, Microsoft, or Google. But the whole idea being that you're simply using their resources, they're developing them, they're providing services to you that you can use. Being really simple from an infrastructure standpoint, your virtual machines, and starting to move into platform as a service and software as a service. So when it comes to Azure, some simple examples that people use for PaaS are things like your backup and DR services, which simply all you need to worry about is your configuration and the data. And then things such as SaaS, we start to move towards 365. And that's like a collaboration suite, your modern work and your email and OneDrive. When we look at something like Azure, Microsoft's in this really amazing position in that they have modern work sewed up, right? They're offering, there's nobody coming even close. So when we actually look to migrate customers to Azure, we're also looking at 365 as well because of the overlap of services. You're not going to move an Exchange server into Azure, at least I hope you won't. There's a lot of these sorts of services that will have a SaaS alternative that's way better. And then when we start to talk about cloud native, we start to talk about services like logical function apps or microservice-based architecture, where you can simply take something that you might be running on a server, take that little function and move it into Azure. And the idea is it'll be more cost effective because rather than running a VM and going, okay, there's 730 hours in a month and I'm going to run it at full size, you pay per cycle. So what could have been, and we've had some great examples of some customers that have taken, servers that are running, scheduled tasks and stuff like this, which is great, moving them into functions and logic apps and going from, hundreds of dollars to, dollars, simply because if you're only paying when it cycles, That's the idea, right? So people move towards native services for a number of reasons, mostly cost effectiveness, the simplicity of scale, and also the ease of development, because they become a lot easier and someone else like Microsoft curates the service. So it's very easy to work with. It's very well documented. It's not like you're not going to be searching for like a lot of the open source players out there, varying degrees of support in terms of go post in that community and hopefully you're not going to get flamed for being an idiot. But with Microsoft tech, it's well supported, it's very well documented, and the drivers that people move towards native is usually around cost effectiveness and scalability.
Yeah, I think you touched on a point that I think is really important to highlight is when you use a hyperscaler, it is well documented, it's well known. There's a broad number of training programs and certifications and a lot of certified people out there that can help you with that solution. So if you build something bespoke, the person who built it is the expert. It's very rarely documented, and it's very rarely got a second or third person who can support. So a hyperscaler solution like Azure, heaps of material out there. You can find it very quickly. You can learn very quickly, upskill your team, and you can get expertise like Azured to come in and help you with it to fill your gaps. So I think, building something bespoke versus off the shelf in Azure, it's a no-brainer to try and go down that route.
No, definitely.
Especially for something that's net new. I think you've got legacy infrastructure. We'll talk a bit about that later. But for something net new, to build your own bespoke infrastructure is a little bit crazy. Like you're just going to pay my company a lot of money to design you something that already exists somewhere else. So
this is a great question because we get into the monolithic versus microservices-based architectures and some of those conversations, which is, I think, heavy conversations so early on. But I agree, right? Like I look at cloud native as the virtualized first approach. With Josh, you and I are showing our age when we start talking about that sort of approach. There was a time when you wouldn't virtualize first and you just get yourself a little pizza box. It was about how small the box was. You could put in the server rack that didn't take up that much space. That DC running on the pizza box is crazy. A great example of something we'd never do now. And we have this sort of virtualized first methodology, and the same for cloud native. If a cloud native or SaaS alternative exists, we should use it unless there is good reason not to use it. And those good reasons can be, your needs don't exactly align to what it can do. And I actually had some customers in the 365 space, and okay, this has been like 10 years. I think I've had one or two. Okay, so I've seen hundreds, if not thousands, of customers in that time. And there were one or two that didn't quite fit neatly into it because they were a huge Apple environment. So all of a sudden, the whole AD organization, who needs that? We're Macs, and usually Macs are just a small subset of the entire environment. So you don't really have to worry about that. But most of the time, you can fit into that ecosystem of like, okay, I should be able to use these services because it works. And to take that methodology, so you can kind of ask that question, because a lot of the time with public cloud is that people simply aren't aware of what's possible. So if you start with a methodology or at least a framework of lets you look for a cloud native alternative first, exhaust that proposition or exhaust that alternative before, spinning up a VM or doing something like that, you'd be rewarded for it. And especially if you choose some of the services in Azure, they'll be supported by Microsoft and all that kind of fun stuff. And there's some great things like increasingly for customers, even some third-party services we've been suggesting, there's Radius as a service. For those people that are still using NPS servers and all that kind of fun stuff, Radius 2.x, there are services that exist you can use. But, you look at the price points, do they make sense? And a good example of that, when Microsoft first released Azure Active Directory Domain Services, so that was their PaaS instance of AD. It was really quite a cool idea because customers like, sweet, I don't have to worry about building a domain controller, Microsoft manages it. But the problem was, like with a lot of PaaS services, like there are going to be restrictions on what you can do and where you can do it. There's sorts of changes you can make to the schema are obviously going to be very different to what you could do to your own schema. And when you looked at the base cost of like running it, it wasn't too dissimilar to having two domain controllers in Azure. So, so there was that kind of, and then there was no migration path either. So the amount of customers that I've had to kind of talk off or talk out of, I want to, migrate my domain. I'm like, don't get me wrong, I'd happily help you do that. but migrating is a rebuild, and a rebuild of domain is not insignificant. And I was actually talking about this with a friend of mine yesterday, where I got to the point where I was, customers would come to me and say, hey, I'm tired of that .local. I'd love to change that to the @domain. And I'm like, before we go anywhere, just letting you know that's like $100,000. Just before you get out of bed. It's so expensive. And people, what are you talking about? It's just changing that one little thing. And I'm like, there is so much reliance on it. And there are probably services you've got an idea, you have no idea. There are groups, security groups, all these sorts of things you've got no idea what's going on, right? So we've got to unpick all of that. So before I even go down that path, I'm saying, are you prepared to spend a lot of money for this? If the answer is no, then let's just move on. Because there are other things we can do, more, better ways to spend that money.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that just shows expertise as well. It's, you want to do something? Just FYI, this is a ballpark of what you're looking at. And then the customer can make a decision whether they want to go down that route or not, because otherwise they might start that project, get somewhat into it and realize we can't stop now.
Yes.
And then they actually have this unbudgeted project, which is quite expensive and high impact and a lot of implications. So I think that's just a great example of an architecture methodology saving a customer from a lot of pain.
Absolutely. And, there's customers we've run into, unfortunately not too many, where they've moved to Azure and they haven't optimized their workloads and they're just bleeding from the eyes. And they're like, Azure's crap. And I'm like, well, no, it's just what's happened here is, and it's not your fault. Perhaps they were, maybe they weren't familiar with what's available. The reality is that if you just take what you've got, move it to Azure, it's not going to be cost effective. You need to look at it. You have to look at how they're going to do it. What can we optimize? Does that service need to be there? In order to get the benefit of cloud, you have to buy in to the methodology, right? If I'm just like, well, I was running this on my on-prem and now I'm running that in Azure, you're not going to get the value because there's more to it than that,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why we work together as well. End-to-end and Azured, we align on that methodology. We do health checks. We make sure we know what's going on. We don't migrate unnecessary stuff. And if there's an opportunity, which we'll cover off a bit more, where it's, say, a VMware environment, they want to go into Azure, well, there's a hop, step, and a jump approach, which allows us to do that a bit easier. So I guess actually that leads us into our next point, which is we've talked a little on native cloud. Now, what's the alternative to native cloud? It's really solutions like Azure VMware Solution, where you've got a hypervisor sitting on top of the hyperscaler, and it allows us to move your VMware workloads into Azure, remaining on that VMware environment, which you could stay there forever, indefinitely if you wanted. Or you can use that as like a landing zone to then start your modernization journey and do that with lower risk and with lower latency towards those native services. So I think that's a good example of, native cloud or public cloud is no longer just you have to transform everything day one. You can actually go in there with very little change. You can do a lift and shift effectively, and then you can go modernize after that. So that's why I'm such a huge fan of that. And obviously, once end-to-end gets customers onto AVS, that's where you jump in and do that modernization piece and optimize as well.
Absolutely. And, we talk of revolution or evolution, right? Like it just comes down to what's the customer's appetite for change, So, and also the appetite and capability for change, because it's not just the technology there. It's all well and good for me to give you the keys to a Ferrari and you don't know how to drive, right? There's also the other aspect, perhaps the less sexy aspect of the cloud operating model, or what you might refer to as the center of excellence, which is the idea that if I'm going to give you the keys to a Ferrari, you don't know how to drive, right? And so with these sorts of things, I look at let's look at the technology. Let's look at how far you want to go. Let's look at how far you can go. And then what's the gap in between you being able to, drive this amazing vehicle that we made for you. And that's also what's going to dictate it, right? Like so many customers move, and whilst there's so many things we could do, there's only a couple we should do. And I look at like infrastructure as code as an example of that. I think there are people that ask me about infrastructure as code for workloads that they're simply going to deploy once. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because the idea is that you're going to write once, deploy many times. And so it's the same thing for customers moving to cloud. That's why I'm a big fan of having an option like AVS. It's not an all or nothing approach, right? There are hybrid options that are available that can meet you where you are. right? You have an incumbent investment in skills in AVS, in VMware Solution, I should say, or VMware. That's very simple for you to kind of move into Azure and then become aware of the greater ecosystem that's around that. There are services that Microsoft have, cloud native services in Azure, that do not require you to spend umpteen dollars I got to move everything into there. One of my favorite ones is logic and function apps. I like them because they can be a replacement for common tasks. I like them that they're a replacement for task servers or just simple things you want to do. Data comes in to this source and I transform it and I move this. Something happens, event-based architectures. And they're really simple, they're really visual, and you're already going to be doing it. Maybe you're doing it with PowerShell scripts, maybe you're doing it with task services or something along those lines. So it's something you're already doing, but this is super easy, super visual. So from a supportability standpoint, we talk about some of the non-tangibles, which is not just like, okay, it's cheap and easy, but also someone else can pick it up. They can go there and they can read it. They can see the logical flow. Oh, okay. So email comes in, you do this happens here, I process this, I move it over there. Okay, you can embed code into it, but it's largely very visual and makes it very easy to support as opposed to some PowerShell script that's 100 years long that is indecipherable. And that's the kind of things you can do around the peripheral. I like to tell customers it's not an all or nothing approach. In fact, it's very much kind of choose your own adventure in a manner that makes the most sense to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where the world's heading is everything's hybrid. Everyone wants choice. People don't want to throw away investment in skills or technologies. So that's why I'm a real fan of these hypervisor and hyperscaler solutions. Is I just feel like it's an easy way for customers to get an environment that's pre-packaged, pre-built, well documented, just like I was saying about Azure, native services, well documented, lots of skills available. You can move there without much change and get something that works. And then from there, you can test things. You can see what works, what doesn't. You can go back and forth, and you can position workloads where they're best fit within the same data center effectively. So within Azure, you can have your VMware environment, you can have native services, and they all just work together, and they're close. That's the other thing. There's not this massive latency gap between workloads, which can cause huge problems. So I feel like that's a hybrid model that's probably going to become very, very popular. Because some workloads, legacy workloads, might be difficult to migrate and transform, but AVS has that covered. And then anything net new comes in native, and then you end up with that nice hybrid. So I think it's just the easy button for customers.
Yeah, and again, I'm going to kind of focus on some of the non-technical side, the people side, which gives you time. For those customers out there that are feeling the pinch. Some of the reasons we see people making a choice towards AVS as well is around there's a push for cloud. Okay, well, you now have your cloud service. Okay, but you can do it in a manner that's not terrible. One of the funny things that had just happened to me personally, my healthcare, they updated their portal, and originally the portal they had for this private healthcare provider was like a gem of the 90s. Yeah, it was functional, but not pretty. But you know what? I don't need that much from it. I need to be able to update details, maybe put your credit card in, put claims in. And they went through this exercise of modernizing it, giving it that UX, that beautiful reactive UX. And in doing so, stripped out all the features. So it was breathtaking what they did. So they took a perfectly serviceable portal, and probably because of time constraints or commitments or whatever, they released a portal that you could do this much. You could log in. You could log in and you could, I can see my cover. I couldn't do anything else. You wanted to do anything? It was nice. They actually had an online chat. You could click on, no, sorry, you can't use that. There's been too many calls now. We've turned this off. You have to call us. Maybe don't call us because we've got a backlog until the end of October of issues to deal with, where people have just, for no reason whatsoever, they rushed the deployment of this software, and then they released it with fewer features that were currently available.
And just to tick that box that it's in the cloud.
To tick that box when you didn't need to. They didn't need to do any of that. It was who was yelling to upgrade that portal? Nobody was. And so it's the same idea here, right? So it's one of those sorts of things where don't do things unnecessarily when you need time to release a new portal. takes time. And the goal should be, I would feel, hopefully, to be at the very feature parity at the very least, not to lose stuff.
At minimum, yeah. If you're moving from A to B and you're not at minimum at parity, there's a big problem. All right, so maybe we'll now talk about projects and how we should approach them, and what's a smart way to go about not rushing these projects to market and causing problems like ruining portals for your health insurance customers.
Yeah, it's a great question. So when it comes to these sorts of things, like the first question is always a pragmatic one, which is my goal isn't to maximize and put every single feature in that Azure supplies, right? The goal is to figure out what's possible and what makes sense for you. I talk about what you could do and what you should do. And so a lot of that's going to be driven not just by technological reasons, where we're coming from will have some influence over where we're going. It's also capability. So then we look at the evolution versus revolution. How far can I go before it becomes uncomfortable or unrealistic? Right? I want it to be a little bit uncomfortable because we're doing something new. There should be a degree of lack of comfort. If it's like entirely the same, then perhaps it's the hardware refresh of cloud migrations, which is not getting the value of cloud because you're probably, you're not touching the cloud native services. So realistically, it starts with that mentality. A lot of time I'll work with customers and we'll simply talk about what are you trying to do? What's possible? This is what's possible in Azure. What are your drivers? Because there's always different drivers. There can be time constraints, which is often one. If it's a time constraint, then you're probably going to choose a solution that's a little simpler because, transformation takes time. It takes time because apps need to be rewritten. And that's actually frequently a conversation we find ourselves having with customers, which is to manage expectations, right? Like if I want to rebuild your application, if I want to make it entirely cloud native, if I want to re-architect it, that takes time. There needs to be regression tests and all this sorts of fun stuff just to get to the same feature parity level. So that's why I kind of want to be realistic with the customer about what they can achieve in a time frame. And also take a multi-phase view on say, look, it's not just one movement now. It's a multi-year strategic approach where we're going to be basically, we're going to start with the low-hanging fruit, which is the services that are simple to replace or augment. So these are things like, I have an Exchange server. It should be in 365. These are things like, services like DNS, right? Like just use Azure. Like if you're used to using your third-party hosted DNS, well, there are DNS options that exist within Azure. So you'll find that there's these logical refactoring candidates that a lot of people are going to use. DR, backup, all those sorts of things, storage. And then there'll be some of the ones that are a little more difficult. Okay, some of the, your custom scripts. Let's look at logic and function apps. And I want to introduce you to what's capable in a way that makes sense. I was talking about this with my one of my architects yesterday. We're talking about AI. And I was talking about the fact that when we look at AI, which is such a fun topic, that the first project you should look at should be modest, should be humble, as much as that's crazy, because the reality is that first project is going to be a big one anyway, right? It's going to be a big one because of the skills, getting familiar with the tools, putting all the plumbing in place to be able to work with AI, all those sorts of things. That's there. That's this iceberg of things you need to do that aren't there for the second project. So if we have a project that's this big, it's still this big because of all that work you need to do to get familiar with the platform, to get skilled, to get the plumbing done, to be able to have the data in an accessible format, to make sure it works. From our perspective, in the way that we're using AI, it started with us actually transforming a couple of apps, changing them, right? Taking off-the-shelf software, and then we opted for ones that natively integrated into Microsoft's Dataverse and actually resided in the Power Platform, right? So that we could very easily interact with the API. All this work needs to be done so that we actually have a very hilarious implementation of AI. We actually have AI that reads and reviews tickets that come in that are unclassified and unprioritized, and then classifies them, prioritizes them, and signs them, and simply reads them. But to do that simple thing, you need to be able to have API access to the data source. It needs to be able to look at what's going on. It needs to be able to interact with the apps. They need to be built in such a way that that's actually possible. And that in itself is all the work. The actual AI side of the fence is actually relatively straightforward. So then that's why I kind of encourage people to take a more modest view with these new technologies that they emerge, because that's going to maximize your chance of success, because that first project, even modest, is still a big one. And then you can start to look at a much more or less modest project in the second instance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just setting expectations is always something that's very important at the start of a project, and making sure you've got something measurable from a business perspective and a technical perspective to actually aim for. And that's just architecture 101, I think, which is sadly missing in the industry, which is why we exist, I guess.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I would say people, they wouldn't need us if they could understand these principles.
yeah, absolutely. So, hybrid solutions. So, we touched on it already. So, a customer's looking to, optimize.
Mm-hmm.
So we do an assessment, we look at their environment,
Yeah.
we get rid of anything that's unnecessary and get rid of any waste. We move them into AVS, and then from there, we've got all these opportunities. So, we can obviously, lift and shift, the bulk of their stuff in without taking over a lot of inefficiency. But I think that step into AVS addresses the problem you raised earlier, which is if you just move it from on-prem VMware into native instances, first of all, it's a big transformation. But assuming that was just a click, it's going to be far more expensive to do that without any sort of optimization than going into AVS, which is one of the huge value props, I guess, of being able to overcommit and benefit from compression and all the virtualization benefits we all know. So to me, those projects that you don't want to, be rushed because of cost, for example, AVS is kind of that enabler to get the workloads onto Azure, look at them, assess them, start your project, run through, obviously in a timely manner, but you're not rushing it. And you're doing it while your workload is running very reliably and safely and at a cost-effective price in AVS, alongside where you're doing your development. And then that enables you to do like a pilot of some of these new services. If they work, fantastic. You can go from pilot to production. If they don't work, well, that's fine. You continue working as you are, and you don't have to do this bulk migration back.
One way.
Yeah, which is horrendous. Like, no one should be trying to go from where they are today to the destination in one step.
Oh, yeah, definitely a recipe for disaster, to be sure. Especially when hybrid solutions, Microsoft's been improving a lot of the hybrid tech that exists, from things like Azure Arc and some of these other tools that allow you to kind of, what they're blurring the line of where that cloud data center edge resides. And they're making it simpler for you to kind of have more workloads with that same kind of cloud management overlay, which is what we start to talk about some of the value proposition that Microsoft brings that make it easier. And especially with some of these solutions like AVS in terms of, well, then that's just blurring the lines of, again, your data center, where it is, what it resides, the tools you're used to, and familiarity. Because at the end of the day, it's simply about, we want to be able to get you to the cloud. We want it to make sense for you, whatever that is. And sometimes the cloud isn't the option, right? Like, that's the other reality. I think I was seeing workloads like pure cloud being like 22% or something of all workloads, right? And there's the reasons for that as well. It could be connectivity, could be a specific way your workload works, or the performance requirements. They could dictate, increasingly that conversation, and as we start to have better connectivity and lower latency that exists between different silos and services inside of Azure, it's becoming less relevant, but it's still there, absolutely. And one of the first things that I'll talk about with the customer too is I'll really kick the tires of, like, I'll ask that kind of seemingly sacrilegious question for someone that specializes in Azure. It's like, why even do it? Because I need to be convinced of what you're trying, or what we're trying to do here. Why are we moving? Are we moving for the sake of moving? What's the problem we're solving? What's the thing we're enabling? What's the edict? Because, to be honest, and this is not always a popular answer, but the truth is, doing nothing is a valid approach in some instances. In terms of, from an architectural standpoint, because ultimately we're constrained by resources, and if we put money in this area, it means we can't put it somewhere else, and there could be things that are more pressing that you need to address. So realistically, that'll also start there as well, just so I can get a feel for, why do anything at all, right? Let's start there, and then build out from there, and have a look at how hybrid works. And again, like I said, to your point, there's a lot of environments where it's going to make a hell of a lot of sense in terms of, I got this huge investment in VMware. Should I throw it out? Nope. Why do that? It's an investment. It's like a lot of things. Like, sometimes customers will come to me and they've developed a lot of cloud native capabilities in AWS, and whilst the simple answer might be like, hey, let's rip you out and put you into Azure, that's not always the way, right? Because it's not just the cloud native app that they've built; it's all the skills around it. right? All my apps, all my devs, they're all AWS certified. My engineers are all AWS. It means the cost of moving isn't just the infrastructure, it's the skills. And it's just, so from the same story here, okay, you got these great VMware skills that are highly, that's sought after in this industry. What am I going to do with that, right? Well, the thing is, we can also take them on a journey. Work with AVS, start to introduce some of these other components that they can do as well. And we talk about that cloud operating model. Where do you want to go? What do we need to do in order to get there? And so that's one of the things I absolutely look out for. Beyond just the technical is also, the people side and the process side, because it's definitely a big part of IT.
It's a massive part. And I think the equivalent from a cloud native perspective versus an on-prem or a hypervisor type is the Nutanix and VMware piece. So if someone's Nutanix on-prem, cool. Well, maybe moving them into Azure VMware Solution is not the quickest and easiest route to get a similar outcome.
Absolutely.
So going into Nutanix Cloud Clusters or NC2 on Azure is a valid path as well. So, if someone's got all their skills in Nutanix, moving them onto vSAN, both products are pretty simple these days, but still, it is a shift. So, going into that solution, and that's one great thing about Azure is they support both. So you can have some Nutanix on NC2 in Azure, you can have some AVS in Azure, obviously, and then you can have your native piece and native services. And some customers have all three.
Yeah.
I've known customers to do all three, and that's fine as well. And at some point, they're going to make a decision, which of the three they're going to keep. They're probably going to keep two. But yeah, let's take the easy route. And switching someone just for the sake of going from one to the other is not always a good move from an organizational perspective, even if it might be technically justified, one product slightly superior to the other in one area. If it's not a massive benefit to the business, then that change is not well justified.
Again, definitely. One of the earliest things that I'd learned when I first became an architect, I thought it was all about speeds and feeds. And I would just, you get lost in, the tech. Particularly I was an exchange administrator, and I would talk about how the data, I loved how it was replicating across from databases and stuff like that. And I remember I was talking to like a GM, and it was just looking at me with glazed eyes. And one of the hardest things was to just abstract away, pull out of that, pull out of this view of just the tech and moving back, and then teaching simultaneously a lot of my team that, you can't have everything. You know what I mean? So we can't always do vendor best practice, guys, because, sometimes I like to use the example of ADFS, so Federation Services. The full ADFS deployment is, I think it's 6 servers or 8 servers, and I've never seen anyone do that. It's because you've got the DMZ, the proxy, the internal layers, and all this sort of stuff. People just use 2, but the vendor suggests 6. And it's the same thing here. And it's a case when I've talked to a lot of my engineers and my team, it's like, well, we have to look at what they're trying to achieve, and we have to recognize they have limited resources. And you have to say, well, what would you love to have? You can't have everything. So what would you love to have? And let's work with that, and let's prioritize those things, because, it's a very rare occasion where a customer comes to you and says, look, I've got unlimited budget. Let's do everything, right? It's more realistic. They'll say, look, here's my constraints. Here's my budget, being one of them. And what can we realistically achieve in this time frame? And that's the other part as well. I think being a good service provider, it would be very easy just to say yes to everything. Oh yeah, we can do that. No problems at all. We can transform that app, and then 6 months later, you mentioned this earlier, we're looking for variations because, there's no way we could do that, but we're just so eager to win the deal or whatever that you're kind of going to talk about that. At the end of the day, I'd much rather just have that conversation. Let's be realistic about what can be achieved in this time frame. If anyone else is telling you otherwise, you just be mindful or wary that there's probably strings attached to that, assumptions. Especially when we look at, often customers will push us we need you to move really quick and rebuild and do all this sort of stuff. And I'm like, the thing is, I know we can do that relatively efficiently, but there's so much on your end, so much testing. If I change something and I rebuilding it, okay, it's not too onerous, but all the testing you do on your side to make sure the application actually functions as you expect, especially if, we're changing to like a modern development platform. To be honest, what we do is like 1/10 of what needs to happen behind the scenes in terms of the code changes and updates and testing and pushing into your environments. And that's something that, I think that customers don't always appreciate is that when you're dealing with this, with a professional services organization or service provider, they know these projects really, really well. So when customers kind of push me on, I'll push it this time frame and I compress it. The reality is that I can probably meet nearly any one of those time frames with the appropriate dependencies and assumptions because I've done this project 100 times. I know where it blows out. I know where the effort lies. So one of the things that I work to do in my business is make sure that I don't, often you'll have those lists of assumptions that they give you. I call it out. I color code them. I'm like, this is really important that you understand these assumptions. It's red because this is where so often customers fall over, because ultimately when a customer pushes you, I push back. But to say, well, this is what you need to know. I need to really make sure you understand that, yeah, we can do this, but how much resource time do you have on your side, right? This isn't just me.
Yeah, it's not just the provider. It's actually a collaborative approach. So to your point about the enterprise has to deal with this project. It's not just the architect or the engineer. It's the whole company who has to get involved.
Yeah.
And like you say, assumptions, I mean, as an architect and yourself as well, it's like, if there's an assumption, it's just a risk. And then there's a mitigation to the risk. And then we go in that rabbit hole. So I say the same thing to customers. You've given me all these assumptions. I'm not happy to even start the project yet, because I need you to understand that all the risks that come along with these assumptions, if that one is wrong, your price will double. And they look at you like this. I'm like, no, I'm just telling you in advance. If that assumption is wrong, your price will go up significantly. And the obvious one is like compression and dedupe. Right? Yeah, that's obviously you're falling off your chair laughing because it's so true. People assume we're going to get 4-1 or 8-1 or some crazy number, and they end up getting 2-1. And the thing I laugh about that is if you don't get that, and assuming you go with a vendor who gives you a guarantee, okay, what is that guarantee actually worth? They're going to give you free kit, okay, free like a puppy, because now you've got to maintain it. You've got to put it in the rack. You've got to power it. You've got to cool it. You've got to, all this stuff that comes along with that extra free hardware. It is not worth it. That actually might impact your total cost of ownership in terms of operational costs, obviously data center space and cooling. If that tips you over into a new rack and you're paying per rack, those extra 4RU or 8RU of drives, could make it not viable to have gone with that solution. And I've seen that before. So assumptions like storage and overcommitment ratios and dedupe, all this sort of stuff, I hate them. So when I do sizing, I assume it's 0.
Perfect.
And customers say, oh, that's a little bit, why would you assume 0? I'm like, well, if I assume 0, right, I know I'm right. Right? There's no longer an assumption. We're just assuming we're getting nothing. And if you get any benefit at all, it's to your advantage. So if we can make the total cost of ownership and the return on investment happen at 0, then you're having a good day, right? But assumptions are the worst. So in all my design documents, I'm the same as you. I'm like calling them out. It's the first part of the document. Everyone has to read it. Like I force feed it down people's throats, because if you make an assumption and you're wrong, it's a bad day.
Absolutely. And I think to your point as well, like when I do the Azure migrations, we do the same sort of thing. I actually do as is. So I'm not, because it's very easy, and you'll see it time and time again, but they're like, okay, with these servers, the 95th percentile is a server at 1/10 the size, but there's a reason that it was sized at that original size. And so when I do these migration assessments, often I like to leave the high watermark. It can be no worse than.
Yeah.
It couldn't be, this is it. I expect it's going to be better, much like you do with dedupe, right? I expect it to be much better, right? Because there's never an environment that it hasn't been better. But then I'm appropriately managing expectations. But provider X said that it would be half the price. I'm like, well, we're both moving to the same platform. We're both using the same data, right? I'm just being realistic to say, okay, we're gonna give you all those advantages. Like anybody would, right? Like if anyone moves they're gonna get dedupe, right? And they're gonna get the same dedupe from me if we're both using the same platform. Where if all the providers use the same platform, they're going to get exactly the same dedupe. But I'm going to be the one that's going to be realistic to go, well, in my experience,
and then I can bet the business outcome on a variable is basically what it comes down to. We're going to guarantee a business outcome, and it's going to be better than what we promise. every time.
Every time.
And I'm not going to do work, and none of my team do work that's anything other than that. What we say is going to be the outcome is what you will get, or better.
I agree. It's a safe place, and also for a customer as well to appreciate that that's who I want to be dealing with. At the end of the day, I want to deal with somebody that's going to be, treating me openly, honestly. Just tell me, even if I don't want to hear it. The amount of times I'm dealing with my dev team, and they'll give me a date that I don't like.
Yeah.
For some of the development we're doing internally. And they're like, what, do you want me to lie to you? Then the question simply becomes, okay, if I don't like that date, what can I do to pull it in? But it's not going to be they work hard. It's going to be, what additional resources are there things I can do? Can I take workload off here? Can we cut feature development here? Can we focus on this? It's going to be something has to change. You don't just get a better date and nothing changes. Something has to change in that triangle of price, quality, and time, right?
Yeah.
Something's got to give. Which one is it?
Exactly.
And that's exactly what we want to. Those are the sorts of best relationships. So if we move into the best relationships with customers in terms of these sorts of approaches, it's, I'd say, very much trust. But I think that trust is earned through our capability. We're approved. We know what we're talking about. But also, allow us to be realistic with you in terms of this is where it is. We're always going to be honest with you. And the best thing you can do is I guess, be aware of what's required on your side. That there is going to be things required. Sometimes, funnily enough, I've had some amazing customers in that they just completely trust you, but they're completely hands off. And that's it's almost like, oh, I love that you trust us so much, but I actually need your input. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure you've had that.
I have. I love it when the customers ask you to write down their requirements. And I know why they're asking, and there's some merit to that, but overall, no, this is me asking you, right? I'm interviewing you as a stakeholder because I want to know what you expect so that I can translate that into an outcome and work out all the steps in between. So, it's great when they give you that trust, but at the same time, I want to collaborate too. I just don't want to come in behind the scenes, do the work, and it's just done. That sounds great, but I think building a relationship with a customer, especially a long-term one, is much more important for both sides.
And also the word cookie cutter comes to mind, where people can kind of, at the end, what does this look, doesn't exactly match our requirements. Well, that's what we need from you. It's just, we do need you to kind of drive us because when we move to Azure, there are different pressures for people, and that absolutely influences what the approach we take. For example, Chef 2012, we'll do a public service announcement. As I think it's the end of support in a couple of days. So Microsoft offers an additional 3 years support if you move to Azure. So these sorts of things, if you've got a driver and that's a significant driver, no more security patches for you.
Stick.
Exactly right. Unless you're just going to cull them from the environment and throw them behind 16 firewalls. But those sorts of drivers can be like, okay, guys, we're going to move quick, as opposed to, and those sorts of things I would advise you to definitely talk to your professional services partner about, because they influence things. Knowing that that's the driver is, to be honest, we've had a edict from the board. We've experienced a breach before, and the board is very cybersecurity conscious. So that's the reason we're moving to Azure. That actually does put the finger on the scale in terms of what we're going to focus on, and perhaps some of the suggestions we're going to make when it comes to those technologies. Maybe we'll focus a bit more on the identity and have a little deeper look into Active Directory, or start to look at things like Sentinel and Defender and some of those other products that sit around the edges of these ecosystems, because that all kind of influences it, and that's how we can make the project even more successful. Because if your stakeholders, to your point, they're asking for these things, then we want to make sure we show them as part of that, part of that end product. And maybe it only changes the project 5%, but that 5% may be the 5% that the board loves.
Yeah, it's the most impactful piece, obviously, yeah.
Absolutely. For us, all the work will be in kind of setting it up, moving it across, doing all the landing zone work. But the most impactful part is that 5% where all of a sudden, oh, wow, I didn't realize we could, we've got these things called Azure initiatives, which are sets of policies and standards that you can apply inside of Azure. Most commonly things like CIS benchmark and ISO 27001 and stuff like that. So that you can kind of make that process of complying with these security standards even easier in future. And those sorts of tools can be really big wins, because when you start to look at the overhead in maintaining compliance with these standards, at least ISO 27001, it can be onerous. And being able to have these, a lot of the work already done in terms of, because we've configured it and set it up in a certain way, and then being able to show that back to the business where they've made, and typically nobody walks towards ISO 27001 just cause. It's usually there's a strategic driver. Maybe it's an advantage that they like to have. They're in the defense or contract industry where that's really, really important, or perhaps it's a way they can differentiate from their competitors, that they have these standards that they adhere to, and you can show that back, and that stakeholder is going to really very much appreciate that.
Yeah, and without that stakeholder input, you can't show traceability from the solution back to the business, because you haven't got anything to trace. So yeah, to me, it's incredibly important. So those stakeholder interviews, write everything down, translate it into something that makes sense and is measurable. And then at the end of the project, you say, hey, here's how we achieved all these things. Or even at the design phase, here's how we are going to achieve them. And here's how we're going to validate that our design's actually going to do, and the implementation is going to do what we say. And then the customer gets these artifacts, and they can go, oh, cool, these are the things we've done. And then like a CIO can put that in a summary and go, all right, here's what we've achieved. So I think that's really important as well, is not just giving them the outcome, but helping them understand what they've achieved and give them artifacts to validate it.
I totally agree. And showing what we've done, because so often what we do in IT is behind the scenes. It's behind the scenes. And as I like to say, nobody thanks you for keeping the lights on. And a lot of what we do is that, but increasingly, and especially with these sorts of solutions we're talking about here, and the likes of AVS and moving towards hybrid, we're opening up IT to be that enabler to what I see IT as is problem solvers. Like, we've got an amazing toolkit here. You look at all the other stuff we start to look in Azure around cognitive services and AI models and all this sort of stuff, but you've got to be there. You need to be in the cloud to be able to use this. I talk about the plumbing. We've got to get the plumbing done. And that means we need to stand up AVS. We need to get those workloads into clouds. We need to get that landing zone sorted. We need to talk about storage, right? And before we can even talk about OpenAI models and stuff like this, we need to talk about, is your stuff in the cloud, right?
Yeah. Are you enabled to take advantage of these capabilities? And that's what we want to do. We want to get that baseline layer, or the 101 is what I call it.
Yeah.
And I would say, like, in my career, people go, oh, you're VCDX, you're whatever. Yeah, 90% of my work is the 101, is getting the baseline foundation of a customer right, so that they can put the layers on top. Because the moment that foundation is not there, it's like a building. It just comes down.
Absolutely, especially from a security standpoint. And, it's, if you build if you've got a flaw in your templates, you deploy them, it's, that's another conversation from a hyperscaler perspective. But it's exactly that. Like, it's not sexy. And it's the same thing I'll talk about with security. The funny thing is, like, what gets attention? That drive-by browser vulnerability that affects 0.01% of browsers. And the funny thing is, majority attacks, they're going to be vulnerabilities. They're going to be unpatched vulnerabilities. They're going to be identity issues. They're going to be people that don't have multi-factor. And that's it. And that's not sexy, because that message seems to be done to death, yet it hasn't. Because if you don't do this, everything else is just not that valid. Everything else is the cherry on top. SIEM, SOARs, XDR, that's all well and good, right? But you just need to start with the foundational aspects. And certainly that's the approach we take when it comes to looking at things like Azure, which is, absolutely, I'm here. Don't get me wrong, I will geek out forever and talking about cognitive services, AI, sexy stuff, right? Really, really cool capabilities. But in order for us to be able to have our dessert, we've got to eat our greens. And to eat our greens, we've got to get our landing zone right.
Absolutely. I love it. I was vegan for many years. So
of course you were. Yes, I remember.
Definitely eating your greens is good in an IT space as well. It makes you big and strong. So that's very cool. So actually, you touched on it earlier about horror stories and problems and what we need to avoid. So you and I obviously know each other well. We've talked about this off air many, many times, very enthusiastically. But let's talk about a couple of the common problems you see with people. I think we touched on one, like stakeholder interviews. If you don't do that, that's a massive mistake in a project, even if it's a very small project. If you don't understand what those stakeholders are, and it might be a tiny company of 10 people, right? If you haven't interviewed maybe the CEO and maybe like one of the operations team and maybe a person in charge of a product or something, then you're not going to get the perspectives you need to make good recommendations. And obviously you need to present back your recommendations to those stakeholders as well. So the moment you don't do that interview and you just are that trusted person who just does everything, no matter how good you are, right? We obviously rate ourselves and our teams, right? We can't do the best job without that step. Like Absolutely. No matter how good we are.
And I'll jump on top of that to say even conflicting requirements is probably the next one, where because requirements have been given in isolation, sometimes they conflict. And I can't do both. I can't be A and not A simultaneously. So sometimes, it helps to get everyone in the same room. So we can say, hey, you've told me you want hybrid. You've told me you want native. Please talk, because I cannot do both.
Right, and we can go, oh, by the way, you've given us conflicting requirements. Here's the pros and cons, and here's potentially an alternative which achieves what you want, but is not what you asked for. Would that be something you'd consider? So all of these discussions and workshops, I think, are so important before you ever get to, that logical or physical design phase.
There's an idea when you develop, and that is that, most of the work's been done before you write any code at all, right? This is going to be in mock-ups and user stories. And, and the reason is pretty simple, because it's really easy to update a mock-up. It is not so easy to update your code fundamentally once you've already started constructing it. And it's the same story here, right, guys? It's kind of measure twice, cut once, right? Yeah, it may seem like we're slowing things down, but I guarantee you once we hit implementation, it goes real quick, right? Because we've aimed so thoroughly. We've gone, yep, we've got it. We're very comfortable. We know exactly what success looks like for you guys, and we're going to go at it. Because once we hit the ground running, like you said, we're damn good at what we do, right? So this part is easy. We've done it hundreds of times before. But the truth is we need to get those requirements sorted out. We need to agree on those things. And the best time to change a design is at the design, within the design phase. Let's ignore Agile for a moment. But within the design phase, not when we're all of a sudden we're in the cloud, we have AVS deployed, and you want to all of a sudden, I think we should pivot to Nutanix.
Yeah, that's too big of a challenge. I actually remember a horror story, actually, and it was, I had a customer, a really great customer, actually, by the way, so when they're listening, they'll know who it is, but great customer, great people, but they were constrained by the organizational procedures, policies, whatever, budgets, all this sort of stuff, and timelines. And they said, Josh, we need you to quote us on this piece of work. And I won't go too more specific than that, but they wanted a quote on this physical layer, right?
Yeah.
Can you design and implement this piece? I said, well, yes, we can definitely do that, but I need to do the conceptual phase first.
Of course.
I need to understand everything you're trying to achieve, and then I need to go logical, and then we can do physical. Here's the price for conceptual. Right. Once conceptual is done, I can give you an estimate on logical, and then here's physical. Right. Because this was a very custom environment. Right. This wasn't a cookie cutter by any stretch. So, no, we just need the physical. I know that's what you want, and that's what we're going to deliver. But this is step one. Right. To get to the physical layer, we need to do step one, which is conceptual. Step two, logical, and then step three is physical. No, we don't have time for that. I said, you don't have time not to. Like this is going to go very bad. Because I know the driver was a ransomware request. Very, very critical for a major organization. I said, cool. So if you want to avoid or mitigate the risk of ransomware, right, this is a significant organizational change, right? This is a big focus here. If you want me just to have a crack at building something that is going to mitigate some of those risks, sure, I can do that. But I'm going to make a ton of assumptions, and the price is going to be through the roof, it's already going to be a big cost anyway for a project of that scale. Do you really want me just to go over and above and just do everything to the nth degree? That's probably not realistic, and it probably can't be done in a timely manner anyway. So your actual date when this implementation is going to complete is likely going to come forward if you go and do it this route via a proper architectural methodology. Whereas if you just want me to have a guess and implement something, we're going to be constantly reworking, rejigging things, re-architecting, and it's going to end up in a dog's breakfast. And I don't want to do that work. And that's the mistake I see, is people just want to get to the implementation phase, which in my experience, is not the biggest part of the project at all.
No, it's not.
It may take the longest, right? There's reasons why it might take a long time, but the most effort is the planning phase, the design phase, validating everything. And then at that point, actually the project's fairly easy. Physical phase is the easiest part of a project.
It's a known, it's a relative unknown. One thing I'd like to kind of highlight as well is that the approach you're taking there is also rare in IT. It takes a lot of skill to be able to tell a customer consistently no, and in a nice way. And I guess what I would tell customers as well is I wouldn't even really expect that from my providers. Often IT people will kind of be like, oh, I'm not sure that's the right thing, and that's the extent of the no. To have someone like yourself sit there and be like, this is the reasons why we do this, and this is why you can't do it, and you said no like 4 times, and and really were like willing to really dig your feet in, because you know the importance of stuff. The truth is that most IT people won't do that. There'll be a little bit of resistance, but ultimately a lot of IT people are trained just to do what they're asked to do, even if that doesn't make sense. Because, as I like to point out, like a lot of people chose IT because they like to not deal with people. If you're
especially an architect. An architect's job is very much a people job.
Exactly.
And I think I'm lucky I have the personality where, a bit of an extrovert. I like to deal with people, but at the same time, I can be introverted as well. I can be behind the scenes, sit in my home office by myself and just get stuff done. So I'm lucky that was just luck that my personality went that way.
It's also like we're the interface, we're the bridge between, the technical and the business, or the technical and the non-technical. And it's super important to be able to, and I guess, like I said, for a customer, to pull these sorts of things out of the people you're working with, because, sometimes they may not say them. And I've had customers that I've worked with that I had to use every ounce of my, negotiation and consultation nuance, or whatever you say, to be able to just walk through it. Because, some people sometimes they come with a bee in their bonnet. We had one particular customer who had insisted that let's say that they weren't happy with what we'd done, and they wanted to work with another partner. And I said, look, I totally understand that there was an incumbent. There was some stuff that happened in the background that wasn't that good, and that was they were given a bit of a bum steer. But I do take umbrage at you calling us not so good, so I'm going to get on a call with you. And so I got a call with that customer, and you're in for a time when the video isn't on.
The video's not on, they don't want to talk to you.
They do not want to talk to me, right? And they were angry. And basically what had happened was they'd got a cookie cutter outcome, but they hadn't participated in the requirement stage when they were asked for requirements. And then they'd complained that, well, what I got was cookie cutter, or what I got was standard. And I said, hey, that's totally true. What you said is true. What you got absolutely was more standard, but you didn't actually participate in the requirements phase. But the person just wanted to do that kind of dump every single problem. This is all the issues I'm going to have. Everything I'm going to say, then I'm going to leave. I wanted to do that one. And so it took every ounce of skill for me to be able to stop, walk. Let's walk through one point at a time. Have to be very calm and composed, as paraphrasing someone's very, very important, right? So one of the most important skills that I have, or that I value, I should say, is the ability to paraphrase and seek agreement. Right, so don't just assume that just because you've explained something to me and I think I understand it, that I actually understand it. I'm going to parrot it back to you. And we went through this process. Just the first one, he wanted to go through everything. I said, please stop. I could write it all down, but the reality is that you'll probably disagree with my interpretation. Right? I could say all my objections. So what I want to do, and it's not rude, I'm going to interrupt you. I'm going to interrupt you when you get to a point, and I'm going to make sure that I understand that point. And so we got to the first point he was trying to make. And I had to no less than 4 times paraphrasing, and he was getting so angry, so irate.
He's in a stressed environment. He's not getting what he thought he was going to get. He's angry, right? It's not really at you. He's sort of just directing his anger and frustration.
100%.
Yeah.
And so, at the end of it, the funny part is when that customer starts to turn around, right? And all of a sudden, like, well, look, if your team was like you, this wouldn't be a problem, right? Like, man, I had to force blood out of a stone here, right? Like, I had to, the amount of composure it takes to, like I said, to be willing to restate a point 4 times until that other person absolutely understands, that's rare. You know, even in our circles, that would be rare, right?
Yeah, very
and
rare.
exactly right. So, you know, that sort of stuff where, okay, but it just highlights the importance of what we do in terms of making sure we understand and not assuming we understand. You know, I'm going to circle back. I'm going to take, you know, a lot of the attitude that I have is I'm going to take as long as it takes to understand your point. If I have to be here for a day, I'll be here for a day until you feel understood and I understand you. And you, not just that, you agree.
Yeah.
You agree that I understand.
We've got a consensus. We've got to a point where we understand they've said their piece, you've said your piece, you've potentially written it down, it's on a whiteboard, like it's in a document. This is what we've agreed on. And I think this is probably our key takeaway actually from this podcast. Please, all the customers and partner, we obviously do partner to partner as well. So please make sure that your stakeholders are involved at the start, that we can validate, clarify, and agree on what we're trying to achieve from a business perspective first, and then the technical team will agree from the technical perspective, and then we move into the design phase and the verification phase and go from there. I think that's pretty much the main mistake, is because if you do that correctly, you actually pretty much fix all those other mistakes. You know, you can make a technical error in implementation, but that's why we do peer reviews and things like that. So I think the main success criteria for a project is stakeholder interviews and making sure we agree on what the outcome is going to look like.
Definitely.
And that they are measurable. This is something we talk about as VCDX methodology all the time, is make sure something is measurable, because the example I always give is a customer says, I want DR. That's not measurable. Sorry, that's 2 words. It says not measurable. Or I want active data centers. Okay. I can give you a data center over here running VMs and a data center over here running VMs. They're not even connected. You have active. And they say, no, that's not what I meant. And I'm like, but that is active, right? That is a version of active. Now, what I think you mean is you want the VMs to be able to move between data centers and you want it to be done live and low latency. I think that's what you mean, but we need to clarify exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
Because one version of active is very different to the other version of active in terms of cost and scope and everything.
Let's say oils aren't oils, right? And so often
it was a Shell ad, wasn't it? Oils ain't oils.
Oils ain't oils, right?
Yeah.
Like, because this is it. And they use the example like cleaning the Yarra. So they talk about, there's this analogy of, if you want to clean the Yarra, and we're going to use hypothetical numbers here, so don't call me out, it'll cost you $50 million to get to 90%. It'll cost you $100 million to get to 95. It'll cost you $200 million to get to 98. So the question simply becomes, how much of the Yarra do you want to clean, and what are you willing to accept?
Absolutely, and that's the whole thing.
And especially for these sorts of things with those customers, active mean that is, there are so many different ways you can do that, especially in Azure, in terms of high availability. I think is even more probably amorphous in terms of what it means, like, until eventually it'll come down to usually commercials.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I can give you active. I can give you sub-millisecond latency and simultaneous transactions being written like to two different areas over a fiber link. But maybe you don't like the price tag on that.
Yeah. And when we get to that stage, if we've actually talked about what we're trying to achieve and the budget becomes the constraint, then we can come back and say, all right, we need to change these because the price isn't changing. The outcome has to be the same, but we need to change some of these requirements to be able to meet the price point. And I think that's, again, highlighting the point of these stakeholder interviews is making sure we get to that point where everyone understands what's constraining us. So if we have a constraint on budget, cool. What are you willing to compromise? If you're not willing to compromise your requirements, then your budget must increase.
Yeah.
This is a simple discussion. It's not emotional. If this is the price for what you've asked, cool. You can't afford that. That's okay. I'll guide you on what I think is the best thing to compromise on, but you have to agree. You have to understand the implications of those. So I think big takeaway here for any migration, any IT project, cloud, native cloud or AVS, whatever, stakeholder interviews with your architects and spend a lot of time doing that. Make it measurable and make sure it's well documented and make sure it's traceable. And if you do that, the chance of your project being successful is going through the roof. If you don't do that, just don't call us. We don't want to do bad work. So, yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up. But Yeah, well, I've had a lot of fun, Anthony, as we always do when we catch up, and
Always a pleasure.
appreciate your time on the podcast, and look forward to doing some jiu-jitsu with you in the near future.
Me too. Thanks, Josh.
Fantastic. Thank you.